Some big numbers coming out of the housing market today, and they're not looking pretty if you're looking to buy or rent.
There's a bidding war for literally every home on the market, every fixer-upper, every house that needs even a lot of work.
Our house had 44 offers on it.
The deurbanization trend, that's a real thing. People are moving out of the city, they're buying bigger houses.
I think the way the suburbs were built was a big mistake. They should have been built very differently.
Home prices in the large urban metropolitan areas were so expensive that people started moving out. And then you see these wildfires, and they're not going away.
Rent growth has accelerated coast to coast in big cities, rural areas, east, west, south, north, just across the entire economy.
How hot is it? It's turning cold. Existing home sales falling in March, but at least in part because there just aren't enough homes to buy.
Shopping for a new single-family home in the U.S. is arguably harder than ever before.
There's a bidding war for literally every home on the market, every fixer-upper, every house that needs even a lot of work.
My neighbors, actually, because we were on vacation, were calling me and texting me saying, like, what is going on at your house? There's people in a line down the block. We saw two people having a fight.
With city dwellers emigrating to the suburbs and families looking for home offices and bigger yards, prices for the American dream home have skyrocketed. Home prices surged in March 2021, up 13% from the year prior, according to the S&P Case-Shiller Index.
Everybody expected housing to really sort of dry up with the rest of the economy, and in fact, the opposite has happened.
With homeowners unwilling to sell, a record low supply of homes for sale has forced buyers into intense bidding wars. At the end of April 2021, there were only 1.16 million houses for sale in the U.S., down 20.5% from the year prior. Higher costs for land, labor, and building materials have also impacted home builders.
So currently in the United States, we have a huge shortage of housing. We're not producing nearly as much housing as we should be.
We know that home ownership is the primary way of getting into the middle class, but unfortunately, there are many impediments to that are divided by class and particularly race.
With the 30-year fixed mortgage rate hovering near a 50-year low and a strong demand pushing prices to all-time highs, why is the housing supply so meager? Is the U.S. running out of houses? The U.S. real estate market is red hot. Since the start of the pandemic, 5% of buyers who purchased a home did so without even physically seeing the home in person. In many markets, competitive bidding wars are the norm.
There's a bidding war for literally every home on the market, every fixer-upper, every house that needs even a lot of work. It's still just a crazy bidding war.
Our house had 44 offers on it.
With his New York City office shut due to the pandemic and looking for more space for his family, in the summer of 2020, Justin Goldberg and his wife Jessica put their 3-bedroom Bloomfield, New Jersey home on the market. The house listed for $399,000.
My neighbors, actually, because we were on vacation, were calling me and texting me saying, like, what is going on at your house? There's people in a line down the block. We saw two people having a fight.
With multiple six-figure offers over the asking price, the house sold for $542,000, over $140,000 more than what the couple was asking for. But the family then found themselves struggling to find a new home.
It was definitely a risk for us to take because we knew that the pandemic wouldn't last forever. His job said you'll be working from home for the foreseeable future and gave up their office space in the city.
With little inventory on the market, the couple signed a 1-year lease on a rental, and on the advice from their realtor, they then modified their house search from looking for a move-in ready home to a fixer-upper.
I'm telling you, immediately you walk into the house that you want to buy and you get the feeling. And I got the feeling. And we walked through the house and it was not in good condition. The bones were there, there was nothing structurally wrong with the house. Everything was technically in good shape. Everything that needed to be changed was pretty cosmetic, but every single room in the house needed changes.
The family of 4 found a 4-bedroom fixer-upper in Randolph, New Jersey, with more space and a bigger yard.
We wanted a bedroom for each of our children, and an extra office or a guest room would have been fantastic.
Although the home was already under attorney review, the couple put in a higher bid and ended up buying the house for $555,000. According to experts, a few key steps homebuyers can take to navigate the ultra-competitive market include getting pre-approved for a mortgage, finding a good real estate agent, and figuring out exactly how much you're willing to spend. An additional option first-time homebuyers have is to rent the home back to the seller while they look for their new home.
My best advice at this time is if you don't want to overspend, go into a house knowing that you're going to do a little work and you'll probably get it for a better price. And honestly, you can turn it into your dream home.
The U.S. has a housing shortage. With potential sellers unwilling to show their homes during the pandemic, in April 2021, there were 1.16 million U.S. homes for sale, down 20.5% from a year earlier. That lack of inventory has helped push the median price of existing homes higher, up a little over 19% from the previous year to a historic $341,600. One key factor in that price jump is with fewer, less expensive homes on the market, sales at the higher end accounted for much of the activity. During that same period, homes were selling in record time too, typically just 17 days on the market. While several large publicly traded companies like NVR, Lennar, Beazer Homes, and Hovnanian Enterprises construct single-family homes, townhouses, and condos, the vast majority of new construction in the U.S. is done by small businesses.
Home building is one of the last real vestiges of small business in America. The overwhelming number of housing, and I want to say it's close to 75 or 80%, is built by small businesses, mostly family-owned, all over the country.
Those builders have faced serious hurdles in recent years, including pandemic-related supply chain disruptions that have caused a spike in the price of building materials like drywall, steel, and wood.
The supply chain is in complete disarray right now from COVID.
The poster child for that is lumber.
As of May 2021, lumber prices are up more than 300% from a year ago. According to the National Association of Home Builders, rising lumber prices have added almost $36,000 to the price of a new single-family home. An aging workforce and challenging immigration policies have also led to a shortage of construction workers.
We simply don't have enough people, therefore labor prices are going through the roof.
Labor was a problem for us during the last housing boom and during the recovery, and it's even more of a problem now because in many places it is easier for potential workers not to come back to work and stay on the sidelines.
An even bigger problem might be the land that houses are built on. As of April 2021, the price per single lot is up 11% compared to last year. Real estate data firm Zonda said new lot supply is down 24% from a year ago.
And the challenge moving forward is infill. How do we invest in cities, into older suburbs? How do we reinvigorate with greater density things like accessory dwelling units for your mother-in-law in the backyard? How do we handle people who are challenged with affordable housing? It's all going to mean that we have new development patterns, we need new forms of housing. So yes, we're not building enough housing, and we need to double or triple that rate of housing just to meet natural growth in our economy. And I think we can do that, but we have to do that by thinking of new forms of housing and really changing our zoning.
Home ownership is a catalyst for building wealth with the added benefit of providing safer neighborhoods for families and better schools for kids. But not everyone can afford to own a home.
That's why the home ownership solution is a solution, even now, for many households. The problem is getting into home ownership.
In the first quarter of 2021, the home ownership rate in the U.S. was 65.6%. According to the U.S. Census, the home ownership rate for white Americans in the U.S. is almost 74%, compared to 49% for Hispanic Americans and 45% for Black Americans. A major hurdle for many is the down payment. Typically, home buyers put 20% down when taking out a conventional mortgage.
We know that typically also requires having a certain amount of income. And for a lot of people, that is much easier said than done. For example, for people of color, it is much harder to be able to put down that type of down payment because they may not have the familiar support as people who come from more affluent neighborhoods.
These gaps are exceedingly troubling because the implications of them are very pervasive. Black household wealth is 1/10 what it is for white households, and a large portion of that gap is due to the lack of home ownership. Even though mortgage rates are at historic lows, there's been a ratcheting up of the qualifications that are required to borrow to become a homeowner. And that has impacted minority households more than majority households.
Buyers paying less than a 20% down payment are often subject to primary mortgage insurance. That can range from an additional $30 to $70 per month for every $100,000 borrowed, according to Zillow. Student debt is another barrier many first-time home buyers face. According to the National Association of Realtors, the average home buyer in 2020 carried $30,000 in student debt.
When I talk to young people, a lot of times they are trying to pay their rent versus their grocery, or they're trying to pay their student loans.
Single-family zoning, pervasive across much of the U.S., limits the number of units that can be built on a plot of land, making it difficult for families to afford certain communities.
Single-family zoning has really been a barrier for lower to moderate income people to be able to live in particular neighborhoods, because single-family zoning bans any type of home being built or any type of multifamily home or any type of detached home from being built, which is a huge barrier to people who are just trying to start off.
But that may be starting to change. In 2019, Oregon became the first state to pass legislation banning single-family zoning in most of the state. Around the same time, Minneapolis became the first big American city to end the practice.
So one of the major impediments to our shortage of housing, in addition to the land economics and the supply chain, is that we have a lot of communities in this country that don't want to have affordable housing. They don't want to have anything other than large suburban estates, if you will. And I think we need greater exercise of federal policy over these local communities that are utilizing exclusionary zoning to really grossly impact the provision of affordable housing.
The federal government is taking steps to increase affordable housing too. In April 2021, the Biden administration announced a $5 billion plan providing financial incentives to push local governments to allow multifamily dwellings in neighborhoods that are currently restricted to single-family homes.
This is a market for housing, for home ownership, for those who wish to get into home ownership and those who are homeowners. People are expanding their homes, they're renovating their homes, they're building out new backyards. So this is a homeowner's economy. There's never been a stronger economy for homeowners than now. And as a contribution to the overall economy, home ownership is more important than ever.
Between remote work and the pandemic, more people and businesses are moving to the suburbs.
The deurbanization trend, that's a real thing. People are moving out of the city. They're buying bigger houses.
We have seen that the housing market was incredible in 2021.
The pandemic itself, it has changed housing preferences and location preferences.
America leads the world in suburbanization.
I think the US is distinctive in that suburbanization has been particularly large in magnitude here in the United States.
And it's creeping up again, of course, but there's an opportunity here to rethink some of those patterns and reset the norm.
I think the way the suburbs were built was a big mistake. The cities needed to get bigger, but they should have been built very differently.
To combat the economic challenges of sprawl, some suburbs are building up rather than out.
Where we build housing, where we don't build housing, and what kinds of housing we build have big implications for the economy, for climate, and for patterns of racial and economic segregation.
The roads in the sprawling suburbs contribute to the nation's $1.2 trillion maintenance funding gap. How else does suburban sprawl shape the U.S. economy? Over centuries, developers built many homes in a pattern that experts call suburban sprawl.
And the farther out you go from the center of the city, we tend to build lower buildings, shorter buildings, more spread out and more space. It gives a little bit more of the illusion that you live off in the country far away from other people.
This style of housing is the foundation of the American suburb and the American dream.
The one thing it does enable people is to kind of escape the city. So there is a benefit and a cost, and individuals are deciding based on their private benefits and costs and making a decision they think is optimal. Sometimes that can have negative externalities for the rest of society.
The New Deal of the 1930s sped up suburban sprawl in the states. The bill created a federal housing administration, which standardized neighborhood design and made mortgages more affordable.
And Fairless Hills is typical of the growing new community.
The FHA guidelines made country-style living a middle-class reality. They also created problems.
They prescribed rules to get an FHA loan. No sidewalks, curvy streets, dead-end streets, and made it hard to walk.
They also enforce a minimum lot size, which spreads people out and inflates the scale of the suburbs.
If that's an expensive community with expensive land, it means that the price of buying into the community is going to be very high. That means automatically the only people who can afford to move in there now are people who are pretty wealthy. A large minimum lot size doesn't say no Black people or no Latinos can move into the neighborhood, but it turns out that income and wealth are really strongly correlated with race, in part because of longstanding discrimination.
Many suburban towns also separate land by use. As a result, homes are generally far away from industrial and commercial areas.
Local governments adopt this so that they have some control over what gets built where, but it also can make it difficult to build the housing that people want to live in places they want to live.
These guidelines were formalized with zoning laws.
These are sets of regulations. There are subdivision codes as well as just regular zoning codes that exist in most municipalities across North America that provide a framework for what you can and can't build. And these were used as planning tools.
Restrictive zoning codes have long limited the supply of land for housing in cities like Minneapolis and San Francisco. Many workers in these cities haven't been able to buy or even rent homes near their jobs, which slows economic development. These old trends are still shaping development today.
It was in the 1940s when the United States population crossed that threshold from being predominantly rural to predominantly urban. And all of the growth since then has really been a shift from rural to suburban.
And since the 1960s, people have been trying to modify the zoning to let people mix uses and have stores, apartments, offices all mixed together, which is what lets you have these sort of lively neighborhoods.
In recent years, neighborhoods outside of cities with large job markets have boomed, while the population in America's heartland declines. As a result, the maintenance costs associated with suburbia are adding up. When a suburb grows, the tax base within the nearby city is expected to decline,
which reduces its ability to fund local public goods, including schools, including policing, and so on. And so those individual decisions, even though they can be good at the individual level, can have externalities for the city as a whole.
So the spread out development that's typical of the suburbs, it entails higher per capita government costs relative to the denser urban areas.
If you're building roads and sewers and all of the houses are located half a mile or a mile away from one another, you need more asphalt and more concrete and more pipes.
Suburban towns often struggle to finance their long-term infrastructure costs, and population growth nationwide has slowed to 0.1%, a record low. That means that the financial pressure on suburban towns is mounting.
All of the declining cities in the Midwest face this problem, that they just don't have the income from their current tax base to pay to maintain something that they built 50 years ago when they were 3 times the size.
So new, so powerful, so revolutionary is this force that we have hardly been able to appraise its influence.
Federal spending can hide the true cost of suburbia.
Local governments use property taxes in particular to pay for a lot of these costs. So if you've ever wondered, why do we have potholes on your neighborhood street and not potholes on the interstate, it's because they're paid for by different levels of government.
America has a $1.2 trillion funding gap for upkeep of roads, bridges, and tunnels. The American Society of Civil Engineers says new spending in 2021's infrastructure bill helps, but it doesn't cover the full costs. If further improvements aren't made, the country's failing infrastructure could cost each family over $3,000 a year by 2039. Another problem?
People don't realize how much of their income goes to their car.
In the past, the suburbs became more popular as cars fell in cost.
Once you take account of inflation, and once you take account of the rise in people's incomes, the real cost of car ownership today is lower than it was. Of course, if you get a frontier car, such as a Tesla, which has features which weren't available in the 1950s, you can pay a lot of money and it can be very expensive.
Since the 1990s, households have increasingly relied on credit to finance their cars. AAA says the annual cost of vehicle ownership has risen to nearly $10,000. Making matters worse, the 2008 recession has destabilized many suburban households. On average, people in the suburbs are now employed at lower rates and have declining incomes. Home prices have also been subdued when compared to central cities. Some call it the suburbanization of poverty.
There's typically a greater availability of land in the exurbs, and the land and housing that's on it also tend to be more affordable.
Experts say remote work and tasteful planning could make the suburbs better.
New growth and density could be directed through redevelopment and infill projects. There are so many of these surplus properties out there.
Many of these infill projects place residents closer to commercial areas, which could create opportunities for entrepreneurs.
If we focus on millennials, for example, they have things that they really like. They have bars, restaurants. So some of those preferences they carry with them. And so what that creates, it creates opportunities for someone to open up a business that caters to these needs.
And I think that sort of plays a big role in that shift of employment to the suburbs.
Experts say the most affordable suburbs are often also the least sustainable.
So, for instance, a metro like Atlanta or Phoenix has managed to keep housing fairly inexpensive over the last 30 years because they just build a lot of housing. And they build these huge subdivisions, 10,000, 20,000 homes on very inexpensive land that's essentially, farmland that's undisturbed. On the flip side, of course, we know that there are terrible climate impacts from building. So there really is a tension.
And you can see that very clearly in California.
You see how close those flames are to these houses.
Home prices in the large urban metropolitan areas were so expensive that people started moving into the more wooded areas. And then you see these wildfires, and they're not going away. In fact, they're getting much worse.
Meanwhile, suburban drivers on beltways are shaping the climate of the future.
It's really in the kinds of suburban settings that we would characterize as sprawling, separated uses, car dependent, relatively low density. This is where we see a more extreme emissions use.
Most U.S. emissions come from personal cars. Commutes lengthened as the country sprawled in recent decades.
So going back to 1970, around 81% of residents lived in the county where they worked. And that declined substantially over time by the year 2000.
If remote work persists, it could take some drivers off the road. Home appliances are another huge source of emissions.
Definitely, when you see more sprawl in the suburbs, you're seeing much more carbon emissions out there than you would in one large building in a city.
The U.S. has committed to eliminating carbon emissions from electricity by 2035. But in that time period, researchers expect U.S. auto emissions to remain flat. That's mostly due to suburban drivers.
But there's an opportunity here to rethink some of those patterns and reset the norm.
So what can be done to improve residential development in the states? Many regions are tackling sprawl head-on. In Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., 85% of the available land has already been developed. The county revised its master zoning code to increase the supply of homes along a forthcoming light rail path.
This is a suburb-to-suburb rail line. You see them in other countries. Paris has an enormous project underway, but for the United States, it is really one of a kind.
Leaders hope the improvements will take 17,000 daily drivers off of suburban roads. Experts say that expanding public transit can make a community more equitable.
Traditionally, lower income communities have benefited disproportionately from public transit options.
But funding and executing such projects is a feat. Residents are paying for the $9 billion suburban DC rail project with an increased tax on gasoline. President Biden's Economic Council wants to encourage more changes like this. They have called for a $5 billion grant program to fund communities that abolish restrictive zoning codes.
One thing to remember is that every part of the country has some walkable mixed-use places that feel like sort of a main street. And we don't have to invent this for real. We've already done this, just recreate what we used to do.
And so that's where we are now, that the kinds of beautiful scenic small towns, mixed use, walkable streets that we remember and we like to visit as tourists pre-exist zoning codes, and in many cases could not be rebuilt again if you wanted to do it from scratch without significantly revising the zoning.
Other parts of the world are experimenting with zoning reform too.
There's been some very interesting work in the city of Bogota documenting how the rapid bus transit network had uneven effects on low and high income workers in that city.
Another study found that changes to the code in Sao Paulo, Brazil, improved the quality of life for renters with college degrees. But those changes also greatly sank home prices, affecting landlords. In America, homebuilder stocks have wavered as the Fed weighs interest rate hikes.
A rising rate environment is going to be very difficult for home buyers. It just takes away from potential buyers' purchasing powers. It means they either can't buy a home or they can buy less of a home. And we know that the entry-level housing stock is the leanest it has ever been.
Suburban sprawl will determine much about the American economy for the foreseeable future. The development choices made today last for generations.
So it seems as though over the medium term, the deck is basically stacked in favor of the suburbs and against the dense urban cores.
Ultimately, people are making those decisions for a reason, and it reflects a very kind of fundamental economic force that you see in many places around the world, in many different institutional settings.
You know, it took really 50 or 75 years to make the problems of the suburbs, and it takes a long time to undo it.
Rent in America is getting more expensive, no matter where you live.
Rent growth has accelerated coast to coast in big cities, rural areas, east, west, south, north, just across the entire economy.
The areas where we are seeing the strongest rent growth are in places like Austin, Texas.
Yeah, so my name is Maria, and I live in Austin, Texas. During the pandemic, a lot of people began to leave, and actually the rent dropped that year by $100. I am due to renew my rent, and there was a spike of $400.
Making matters worse, few of the new homes in construction are affordable.
Rental demand continues to be extremely strong, and the rental units that are being built are the more expensive ones. That is, the higher end ones.
Meanwhile, workers' pay isn't increasing enough to match the new rent.
We had wage suppression for 40 years, and then we have the period now where wages are growing, especially at the low end. And so the question is, how long will that continue?
Experts say the rent increases will have an impact on the economy.
A lot of the monthly expense for the typical household is money that's going toward the rent or to upkeep of the house. So it is a very important part of all of consumer expenditures.
In the most competitive markets, rents are creeping toward record highs. Renters in smaller markets are feeling the squeeze too. For example, one-bedroom rentals in Gilbert, Arizona spiked over 116% in the past year. Meanwhile, rent for a single-family home is growing at its fastest pace since 2005, according to CoreLogic. So how did we get here? One answer is the bounce back from the pandemic.
You saw tech companies, major firms moving to smaller cities, cities like Pittsburgh, Austin, San Antonio, Charlotte. These are cities that really started booming because workers had more flexibility. And when the city starts booming, of course, the rents go up because it's a supply and demand issue.
But the story goes back further than that, all the way back to the Great Recession.
President Obama, are you listening?
This has been building really since the end of the financial crisis back a little over a decade ago. A lot of communities have made it more difficult to build more homes closer to the urban cores. Building materials, particularly lumber, has been in short supply. That's been a problem. Labor, a lot of people left the construction trades in the housing bust back a decade ago. And because of the changes in foreign immigration laws, we have a lot fewer foreign immigrants coming into the country. Many of those folks would work in the construction trades. Also, a lot of smaller builders, they rely on loans from banks. And since the financial crisis, banks, particularly smaller banks, mid-sized banks, have been unable to, because of regulatory changes and other reasons, unable to provide enough loans. So, there's a melange of things going on here.
After the financial crash of 2008, house building stalled. By the end of the tens, renters had fewer options, especially in real estate hotspots.
Pre-COVID, we saw a huge rush to urban centers. Millennials love to live in cities longer. They were actually living there longer than the previous generations their age had because they weren't able to get out and afford to buy homes because home prices were so high. So you had so much demand in the cities.
Then the pandemic hit.
So if you look at some of the high-rise apartment buildings in the really dense central business districts, the big cities, rents were actually declining in the first 12 months of the pandemic.
But smaller cities like Phoenix and Austin received more of those remote workers. That sent prices upward for people like Maria.
Right now, I would say for a studio is probably $2,000. This place, it's a one bedroom, was originally set at $1,700 when I first moved in.
Maria is a teacher and needs to commute to work every day. She and many other Americans don't have the luxury to move further away from work to save cash. That's creating wider issues in the economy.
There's a lot of evidence that the lack of housing closer to where the demand is in urban cores is having a meaningful negative consequence on long-term economic growth. So if we can figure out a way to change zoning rules and laws and get the lumber and land and labor that we need and able to build closer to where the jobs are, our economy will be able to grow more quickly, more strongly in the longer run.
Renters in the traditionally cheaper suburbs are feeling the burn too. Economists say that finding any home to rent right now is uniquely difficult.
Because the vacancy rates are really so low. It's the lowest we've seen in a generation.
Coming out of the pandemic, it's likely for rents to keep rising.
Fortunately, builders are ramping up their building. They can make a lot of money, with rents this high and house prices this high. So they have a lot of incentive to put up more homes, and that's happening slowly but surely. We are seeing more homes put up.
So that's a good sign. And we've seen an increase in single family housing starts. That's really important because that's the preferred housing structure during the pandemic. So having investors come in, buying homes, maybe it puts a little upward pressure on home prices. Sure, maybe it does. But it does increase the stock of single family rental homes available in the market and should help to moderate rent growth.
And in the cities, some realtors are weighing whether to convert their less busy office districts into residential neighborhoods.
The idea is to say that there are some empty buildings, brick and mortars already established, but maybe one can repurpose it into residential units.
For the short term, renters are dealing with the market.
If I had signed the lease, it would be taking a lot of my savings. And so I decided to move to a new building. I'm losing about 150 square feet.
These hikes are hitting U.S. citizens at an inopportune time. Over decades, wages for most workers have stagnated.
The wages and benefits of a typical worker were suppressed in the period 4 decades after 1979. Growth was very slow. There was growing inequality that worked against the middle, in effect, against anybody in the bottom 90%.
In 2019, Oregon became the first state to impose statewide rent control. They cap increases at about 7%. Cities like New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. also limit rent increases. These policies have some benefits. One study found that renters were about 20% more likely to stay in their homes with rent control. Other economists think that rent control does more harm than good.
So what history has shown is that by putting a rent control, yes, it's benefit temporarily for people to pay lower rent, but that deters incentive to build more homes or provide money for maintenance. So all the housing stock steadily deteriorates over time, and one does not want to see that. So we want to encourage more production.
The answer to rising rents may be in the job market. Both Congress and the Fed have pumped stimulus into the economy. It should, eventually, help some workers earn higher wages.
There's been a huge increase in the demand for goods and services. So we're going to see a period of sustained low unemployment, I think. This has always led to faster wage growth for those in the middle and the bottom. The other related question is, will we see the structural changes that will build this into the economy rather than be an episode of a period of low unemployment? And I think that will require improving labor standards, putting in the $15 minimum wage, rebuilding collective bargaining. I think it will mean paying attention to maintaining low unemployment.
Which means that the answer to rising rents might be getting yourself a raise or finding roommates.
They're not building enough affordable housing right now because for builders, the cost of construction is so high due to a high cost for land, labor, materials, shortages for materials, shortages of labor, that they can't build affordable housing.
It took us 10 years to get into this, predicament. It's not going to be solved next year or the year after. It's going to be 10 years before we solve this problem.
Some big numbers coming out of the housing market today, and they're not looking pretty if you're looking to buy or rent. It's all getting even more expensive.
Home prices in the U.S. have climbed at a record pace during the pandemic. The median home price reached over $363,000 in June 2021, a 23.4% increase from 2020. Many of these houses are being sold above their asking price, often entirely in cash, with bidding wars becoming the new norm to weed out the competition.
At the beginning of the pandemic, the Fed cut interest rates to zero, and that dropped mortgage rates to historical lows. And as soon as people figured out how to buy a home in a safe manner with social distancing, people came right back to the housing market.
So you can see in just basically the last 15 months or so, we've seen a dramatic acceleration in home price growth to levels we haven't seen in decades.
How hot is it? It's turning cold. Existing home sales falling in March, but at least in part because there just aren't enough homes to buy.
While the market has cooled down considerably in June compared to its peak, fears of a housing bubble are becoming prevalent among many homeowners.
I think it was sticker shock. I think a lot of people got in there and said, I just can't afford this. And that's why home sales came down.
Almost every conversation that I've had over the past decade is, well, one, there's this fear that we might find ourselves in another crash, and buyers don't want to be the ones holding the bag in the middle of that transition of a shifting market.
If a housing bubble were to happen, it would mean that a very large portion of Americans' wealth are tied up in risky assets, and they could lose a lot of their wealth as soon as those home prices drop.
So is America currently in another housing bubble? And what are the signs that can help investors predict an oncoming crash? A housing bubble occurs when strong demand and wild speculation drive up the price of residential real estate to the point of collapse.
It's hard to look at any one data indicator to know whether we're in a housing bubble or not. The signs that I would look for are actually more intangible, kind of a mindset that people start to adopt. If people go into buying a home thinking that they're going to get this instant return.
If you see a lot of speculators in the market bidding up prices, if you see a lot of people or home buyers buying homes with no money down or very little money down, those are some telltale signs. If you see credit too easy, then that can be a telltale sign as well.
If a bubble is left unchecked, supply will continue to rise in order to meet the strong demand, and prices will climb beyond a reasonable amount. When demand suddenly and unexpectedly decreases, it leads to a sharp decline in housing prices, bursting the bubble.
Housing bubbles eventually pop because people start to realize that what's going on isn't sustainable. As soon as people, see their neighbor selling their home, and maybe their neighbor accepts a little bit less than what homes were worth when they bought, then they may start to get nervous and sell as well, and then it becomes like a cascade. Bubbles tend to burst pretty quickly, so that's why one day you might have your home go down in value like 20% because the bubble burst.
But sometimes the market requires a more drastic incident to crash on a national level.
Catastrophic economic event. That's it. You need a catastrophic economic event to make a housing bubble pop. You can definitely have a pullback in the heat in the housing market, but to really have that market crash, there needs to be that event.
There have been numerous housing bubbles throughout history, going back as early as 1837. Compared to other equity busts that occur on average every 13 years, it's far less frequent. However, the International Monetary Fund discovered that housing crashes usually last nearly twice as long with output losses that are nearly twice as large, leaving a much more detrimental impact on the economy. The 2008 financial crisis is a prime example of how a real estate bubble could potentially contribute to an economic meltdown.
A lot of people got a firsthand experience in what it's like to see your home go down in value. Some people end up losing their homes if they weren't able to continue making their mortgage payments, and then they couldn't sell at a higher value than what they bought it for, so they would end up having to take the loss themselves or end up in foreclosure. So all of that can be very damaging to people, and I think it's very understandable that people are concerned about that happening again.
Demand off the charts, prices rising at the fastest pace in 15 years. But is the market too hot? Is it overheating? A bubble, as they say.
So is the recent real estate rush a sign of a housing bubble? According to most experts, the market is shaping up to look more like a boom rather than a bubble.
I don't expect that we're going to see a house price crash. I don't think we're in a bubble.
We say bubble because we can't believe how much prices have gone up. But really, a bubble tends to be something that's inflated that could burst at any minute and change. And that's not really the case here.
While speculation certainly is a factor, the main cause for today's demand is in the low mortgage rates. At the start of the pandemic in March 2020, the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage sat at 3.45%. In July 2021, that number had dropped to 2.87%.
We've got 30-year fixed-rate mortgage rates for much of the last several months below 3%. That's a phenomenal rate. It's rock bottom. It's a record low. I don't see them going any lower. But that is one of the reasons why that has led to this pickup in demand to buy homes and has added the fuel necessary to push home prices up.
Supply is also an issue. According to the National Association of Realtors, the U.S. has underbuilt its housing needs by at least 5.5 million units over the past 20 years. That's a stark comparison to the previous housing bubble in 2008, when overbuilding was the issue.
In my town, which is Marblehead, Massachusetts, as of this morning, we had 17 single-family homes on the market. 17. So, and that's not even considered bad. Some of the surrounding towns, the town next door, they had 5 single-family homes.
So we've got really the demand and supply forces coming together. We've got a boost in demand that's fueled by record low mortgage rates, and we've got a shrinkage of supply as many of the older homeowners decided to postpone listing their home for sale and wait until a later date when the pandemic was in the history books. So between more demand, less supply, prices are up, and they're up at the fastest pace since the 1970s.
There also haven't been any signs of a lending bubble, which is often associated with housing busts. Most of the new mortgages today are fixed rate compared to the riskier adjustable rate mortgages in the past.
Subprime loans are those loans made to borrowers or to applicants who have very, very low credit scores. Those are gone from the marketplace. What's also gone are the liar loans. Just about all of the mortgages today are fully documented, documenting income, documenting employment, documenting financial assets, so that both the borrower and the lender have some assurance that the borrower has the financial capability to manage that mortgage loan over time.
Furthermore, rapidly rising home prices saw a correction in June 2021 after sales of newly built homes dropped to the lowest level since the early days of the pandemic in April 2020.
I think it was sticker shock. I think a lot of people got in there and said, I just can't afford this. And that's why home sales came down. We did see some more supply come onto the market, and that's helpful. And that's a lot of sellers saying, well, if this is the height of the market, I want to get in now. But again, they're not going to get that top dollar if people can't afford it. So I think we're at kind of a turning point, as in the housing market is cooling down on sales, but prices may stay elevated if we don't get enough supply in there to meet the current demand, which does still exist.
The U.S. might be safe from a housing bubble at the moment, but that doesn't mean another crash will never happen again. But there are certain indicators that could signal danger on the horizon.
What would be unusual, where you should fear about home prices really starting to plummet, is if you look around and you see all this new construction in your neighborhood, and yet home prices aren't moderating at all, despite there being all this added inventory. If you see a whole lot of flips, a lot of investors coming in, doing modest improvements to the home and then getting a whole lot more than they put in when they end up selling, that would be a sign that the housing market is starting to look a little bit unhealthy.
While the thought of another crash is certainly scary, experts say that a real estate crash similar to the one during the 2008 financial crisis is unlikely to occur again.
The market today is not in danger of a housing bubble bursting because everyone out there who owns a home has a mortgage that was underwritten responsibly.
Some of those changes were due to the Dodd-Frank Act, which also then created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and through some of the regulations that have been promulgated that has really assured that mortgages are underwritten in a prudent fashion and provide for mortgages that can lead to sustainable home ownership for the home buyer over time.
But for both current and potential homeowners that remain worried, there are certain measures that can be taken to lessen the risk.
If you're a home buyer today and you're concerned that prices are overheating and you're buying at the top of the market, the most important thing you should do is not overpay for your house.
If you feel the price is higher than what you're comfortable with, higher than what you think the true economic value of the home is, then step back from it. You don't need to buy now.
The mindset that I would encourage homeowners to have is a very long-term mindset. Like, it doesn't really matter if home values go down for a couple of years if you're gonna hold and not sell for a decade. So I would just, keep your eye on the long-term goals. Make sure that you have enough savings that you could keep paying your mortgage payment, even if you lost a job, even if you lost some income, so you can ride out any temporary dip in the housing market.